Beauty and the Beast, the Adult Storybook Edition, written by Raymond Davey, spoken by Alex Inglewood. This adult version of the classic fairy tale follows the original storyline, but it is set in a gritty, crime-ridden world, where Belle is a fierce, no-nonsense lady of the night, and the Beast is more human than monster. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss out on any new stories, whether they're reimagined fairy tales, classic plays, or timeless legends, and it helps support more content like this. Now, sit back, relax, and join me as we begin our journey into the world of Beauty and the Beast. Chapter 1: A Harsh World. The moon hung lazily over the streets, casting a dull yellowish glow on the cracked pavement and flickering neon signs. It wasn't quite romantic, more like a cheap stage spotlight, illuminating a scene too gritty for the faint-hearted. Belle stood on the corner, the hem of her too-worn leather jacket flapping in the breeze. She was the picture of a woman who had long since learned that dreams were for people who could afford to sleep at night. Belle took a drag from her cigarette, watching the slow crawl of cars down the street. The town was a dump. It had always been a dump, but it was her dump, and there was a certain charm in that. At least, that's what she told herself on nights like these. Across the way, the bar was spilling out its usual crowd of drunks and lowlifes, staggering into the street like zombies, only less interested in brains and more interested in anything with a pulse. Belle eyed them with a dispassionate glance. "Look at him," she muttered half to herself. "If there's a God, he's got one sick sense of humor." The streets weren't just rough, they were brutal. Every corner had its ghosts, whether they were the remnants of forgotten dreams or the whispers of promises made and broken in the dark. Belle was no stranger to either. This wasn't a world for fairy tales. It was a world where survival was the name of the game, and if you wanted something better, you'd have to take it by force, or die trying. At that moment, a girl stumbled past her, heels too high, lipstick too smeared. Belle recognized her, Rose. Young, naive Rose, who still believed in knights in shining armor. The poor thing was going to get herself killed one of these days. Belle snuffed out her cigarette, flicking the butt into the gutter as Rose approached. "You're late," Belle said without looking up. She didn't need to look. The sound of Rose's footsteps told her everything she needed to know. Hesitant, like she was constantly on the edge of deciding to run, but never quite brave enough to do it. Sorry, Belle." Lost track of time, Rose stammered, nervously adjusting the hem of her too-short skirt. There was always something fragile about her, like she might shatter at the slightest touch. "Don't be sorry. Be smart," Belle replied, her voice as sharp as the crack of a whip. "Out here, being late can get you killed, or worse." Belle gave Rose a once-over, noticing the smudged mascara, the shaky hands. "You all right?" she asked, softer this time. For all her tough talk, Belle had a weak spot for Rose. The kid reminded her too much of herself when she first started out, green, hopeful, and destined for disappointment. Yeah, just had a rough night," Rose answered, her eyes darting around nervously as if she expected something or someone to jump out of the shadows. "You're working the wrong corners, then," Belle said with a smirk. "Stick close to me tonight, all right? I've got a feeling." And she did have a feeling, though she'd never admit it out loud. It was the kind of prickling unease that settled in your gut and wouldn't let go. The streets felt heavier tonight, like they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Belle didn't believe in omens, but she did believe in her instincts, and right now they were screaming at her to watch her back. "Come on, let's move," Belle said, tugging Rose along as they walked toward the usual spot. They'd been stationed here for months, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, something thick and oppressive, as though the city itself was waiting for a storm to break. The cars slowed as they passed, windows sliding down just enough for Belle to catch the hungry stares from the shadows inside. She turned her face away. She didn't need to see them to know what they were thinking. She'd seen that look too many times before. "Who are we waiting for?" Rose asked, her voice shaky. "No one," Belle said flatly. "But someone always shows up." And just like clockwork, a familiar figure appeared from the shadows. A hulking man with a permanent sneer and too much swagger for his own good. Leo. Pimp, thug, and all-around bastard, though he'd probably describe himself as an entrepreneur. He strolled toward them like he owned the world, and for all Belle cared, he could have it. She had no interest in power games, but Leo liked to play them. Well, if it isn't my favorite girls, Leo said, his voice slick as oil. Business good tonight? Belle shot him a look that could melt steel. We're fine, Leo. No thanks to you. He chuckled, the sound low and unpleasant. Always with the attitude, Belle. It's why I like you. You've got fire. He reached out to stroke her arm, but she jerked away, eyes flashing with barely concealed disgust. Touch me again, and I'll show you just how much fire I've got, she warned, her voice low and dangerous. Leo raised his hands in mock surrender, grinning all the while. Relax, sweetheart. I'm just checking in. Can't have my girls out here without supervision, can I? You're not the boss of me, Belle said, her eyes narrowing. We work the streets, not for you. Sure, he said, waving her off, though the threat in his smile was clear. Just remember who runs things around here. You might be tough, Belle, but there's always someone tougher. With that, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Belle with a sour taste in her mouth. She hated Leo, but more than that, she hated the way the streets bent to his will. He was a parasite, feeding off the misery of others, and no one ever seemed to do anything about it. Why do you let him talk to you like that? Rose asked quietly. Belle sighed, lighting another cigarette. Because out here, talking is the least of my problems. As Belle exhaled a cloud of smoke into the cold night air, she felt it too. Something was coming. She just didn't know what yet. Chapter 2. The Beast. The night stretched on, and the streets thinned out as the regulars faded into the alleyways or back into whatever dingy holes they crawled out of. Belle leaned against the wall of the crumbling building, watching as the last car of the night crept by, the driver's face a blur in the dim light. She wasn't in the mood to make a sale, but that wasn't exactly a choice anymore. She caught Rose fidgeting out of the corner of her eye. You keep twitching like that, someone's going to think you're running from something. Rose glanced at Belle with wide eyes. Maybe I am. Belle rolled her eyes, letting out a low groan. Look, if this is about Leo again, I already told you he's just blowing smoke. He's too much of a coward to actually do anything. No, it's not Leo, Rose whispered, casting a nervous glance down the street. It's him. Belle raised an eyebrow. Him who? You know, the guy from the mansion. Belle snorted, flicking her cigarette butt into the gutter. You've got to be kidding me. That's just a bunch of bullshit. Victor's nothing more than some old creep with a face like bad roadkill. Rose shook her head vigorously. It's not just that, Belle. People say he's dangerous. They say he takes girls. Belle squinted at her. And what? Eats them? Gets his kicks torturing people in that creepy old house of his? You're starting to sound like every drunk in this town. You can't believe every ghost story you hear. Rose shuffled her feet, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. But he did take someone. There was this girl, Becky. She used to work down near the bridge. One night, she just vanished. No one saw her again. People say they say Victor took her. Belle's smirk faded slightly, but she shrugged, masking her unease. Maybe she ran. Maybe she got smart and decided to leave this dump. There's a million reasons people disappear around here, and most of them don't involve some freak with a scarred face. Rose looked unconvinced. Maybe. But I heard Leo talking about him. He said Victor's been getting bolder. He said the guy's dangerous, that we should stay away from the edge of town. Belle rolled her eyes. Of course Leo would say that. He hates the guy. Victor's cut into his business, and we both know how much Leo loves money. It's all power plays with him, Rose. He probably started half those rumors himself, just to keep us in line. Rose chewed her lip, glancing nervously toward the edge of town where the streetlights barely touched. I don't know. I just get this feeling, like something's off, like something bad's gonna happen. Belle studied Rose for a moment, her eyes narrowing. She'd heard the whispers about Victor before. Everyone had. The beast of a man who lurked in his mansion, broken and twisted by whatever had happened to him. Some said he was cursed. Others said he was just a bitter recluse who liked to toy with people. Belle wasn't one for fairy tales, though. In her experience, the real monsters were the ones you could see, the ones with greasy hair and leering eyes who thought they owned the world. Still, there was something about the way Rose said it that made Belle pause. She shrugged it off. "Victor's nothing more than a freak with a chip on his shoulder," Belle said, brushing it off like it was nothing. "But even if he's dangerous, he's not my problem, and he's not yours either. We've got bigger things to worry about, like Leo and how we're going to make it through this week without getting caught up in his shit." Rose didn't seem reassured, but she nodded anyway, though her eyes still lingered on the distant shadows where Victor's mansion stood. Belle had always figured Victor for the kind of guy who enjoyed his own isolation. There were stories about him being burned or scarred in some accident, maybe even something shady. The few people who had seen him talked about his face like it was a crime scene, raw, ruined, and something you didn't want to look at for too long. And yeah, there were the stories about girls disappearing, but Belle knew how this town worked. Stories had a way of getting twisted up real fast, and fear was a business all its own. Belle turned to Rose and snorted. "Let me tell you something about Victor. I've been working these streets long enough to know that the guys who stay in the shadows do it because they're hiding from themselves. The only thing Victor's dangerous to is his own reflection." Rose didn't look convinced, but Belle didn't give her the chance to protest. "Come on, let's call it a night. Nothing good happens after this hour anyway." As they started to head back, Belle glanced toward the mansion in the distance, half hidden in the fog and shadows at the edge of town. The place had always given her the creeps, but she wasn't about to let some half-baked rumors get under her skin. They walked in silence for a bit before Rose spoke up again. "You know, there's another story," she said softly, as if afraid to say it too loud. "People say Victor wasn't always like this. They say he was cursed or something, that he's looking for someone." "Looking for what? A plastic surgeon?" Belle scoffed. Rose bit her lip. "No, someone who can break the curse." Belle stopped in her tracks and turned to stare at Rose, her expression unreadable. "Rose, are you seriously trying to tell me that this is some kind of fairy tale? Cursed beast looking for love to break the spell? Jesus, I thought you had better sense than that." Rose fidgeted uncomfortably under Belle's glare. "I don't know what I believe, Belle. I don't want to end up like Becky, or like the others." "There are no others," Belle said firmly. "It's all bullshit. And even if it wasn't, we've got our own problems to deal with." Rose nodded, though the worry never left her eyes. They continued walking, but the tension hung in the air between them, thick and oppressive, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Belle shook her head, irritated at herself for even entertaining the thought for a second. Victor was just a man with too much time and too much bitterness. And if he was dangerous, well, he wasn't half as dangerous as the other men Belle had dealt with. Still, as they walked away, Belle couldn't help but glance back one last time toward the dark silhouette of Victor's mansion, standing alone on the hill like some forgotten relic. Chapter 3. The Kidnapping of Rose. It was a few nights after Belle and Rose's talk, and the streets were just as unforgiving. The air carried the usual stench of cheap whiskey, spilled guts, and bad decisions, blending into a cocktail of despair that the town was all too familiar with. Belle was back on her corner, same as always, but something was off. Rose wasn't with her. Belle glanced down the stretch of road. The night had started like any other, noisy drunks, greasy lowlifes, and cars with sleazy men crawling at a snail's pace. Rose had been there too, standing a few feet away, her dew-eyed innocence still a magnet for the wrong kind of attention. But now, Rose was gone. Belle hadn't seen her leave. At first, Belle figured Rose might have finally wised up, ditched this life, and run off to whatever greener pastures a girl like her could find. But something gnawed at Belle, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. She knew Rose wasn't that lucky, and besides, this town didn't just let you slip away unnoticed, not unless someone wanted you gone. Belle paced in place, lighting a cigarette and scanning the street again. Her sharp instincts told her this wasn't just Rose being flaky. Something darker was happening. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Leo's slick figure slinking out of the bar across the street. His ever-present swagger looked more pronounced tonight, as if he was walking around with a secret he couldn't wait to dangle in front of someone's face. Belle's gut tightened. She stubbed out her cigarette, her mind already racing ahead. She cut across the street, ignoring the passing catcalls from a group of idiots parked on the curb. Leo saw her coming and leaned against a lamppost, flashing a grin that made her want to slap it off. "Belle," he purred, "you looking for a dance partner tonight, or just bored?" Belle didn't slow down. "Where's Rose?" Leo raised an eyebrow, pretending not to understand. "Rose? Which one's that again?" Belle clenched her jaw. "Don't play dumb, Leo. The girl who works for you, she's missing." "Oh, her?" Leo smirked, lighting a cigar like he had all the time in the world. "Yeah, I haven't seen her in a bit. Maybe she's finally taking a break from the nightly grind. Can't say I blame her." Belle stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You know where she is." Leo let out a chuckle, thick with sleaze. "Why, Belle? You worried about her. Thought you didn't give a damn about anyone else on these streets." "I'm asking you one more time, Leo. Where's Rose?" Leo puffed on his cigar, blowing smoke lazily into the air before leaning in closer. "You're not going to like the answer, sweetheart. Seems your little friend wandered off toward the mansion. Now, I don't know if you've heard, but people don't exactly come back from there." Belle's stomach tightened. "The mansion?" "Victor's place," Leo said, his voice dropping into a low, mocking tone. "Or, as the town likes to call him, the Beast. Guess Rose was looking for a new employer. Can't say I blame her for wanting to trade up." Belle's fists clenched. Leo watched her reaction with amusement, his grin widening. "But you know what's funny, Belle? I didn't even have to tell her to go. Seems like the Beast's got his own kind of pull. Something about him, I don't know, it's magnetic. Or maybe he just pays better than I do." Belle's mind raced. Rose wouldn't have gone to Victor willingly. She wasn't stupid. Whatever this was, it reeked of something darker. Leo's taunts only confirmed her suspicions that he'd had something to do with it. "What did you do?" Belle hissed, her voice low and deadly. Leo shrugged, flicking ash off his cigar. "I didn't do a damn thing. Maybe Rose got tired of being a two-bit nobody and decided to see what life's like on the other side. Hell, maybe she wanted a Prince Charming. Or maybe Victor got sick of waiting and decided to take what he wanted. Either way, she's gone now, and I wouldn't recommend going after her." Belle's gaze hardened, but Leo's expression didn't waver. He was enjoying this, playing the puppet master, pulling strings just to watch her react. "You think Victor's some kind of fairy tale, don't you?" he said, laughing darkly. "Well, Belle, here's a reality check. He's the kind of monster that fairy tales were written about. You go looking for your little friend and you might not come back." Belle's blood boiled, but she knew better than to punch Leo in the mouth. He'd only enjoy it, and she had bigger problems to deal with now. If Rose was at Victor's mansion, then Belle had no choice. She was going after her. "Stay away from the mansion, Belle," Leo called after her, his voice dripping with condescension, "unless you want to end up like her." Belle didn't bother responding. She was already walking away, her mind set. She didn't believe in fairy tale monsters, but she knew a real one when she saw it. Victor might have been dangerous, but Leo was the real problem here, always stirring the pot, always setting people up to fail. If he thought he could scare her off with ghost stories, he was wrong. Belle took a sharp turn down a side street, her mind racing. Rose had been desperate to avoid Leo's wrath, and now she was gone. Victor might have taken her, but it didn't add up. Why would he bother? Belle had always pegged Victor as a bitter recluse, hiding from the world because the world didn't want to see him. But taking girls? That was new, and it didn't fit. She had to figure out what was going on, and there was only one way to do that, by heading straight into the Beast's lair. As she walked through the dimly lit streets, Belle felt the weight of the night closing in. Rose was out there somewhere, and Belle wasn't going to let her become another ghost story. This wasn't about fairy tales. This was about survival. She was going to get her friend back. And if Victor had something to do with this, then he was about to find out exactly who he was dealing with. Chapter 4: Journey to the Beast's Lair. The cold air bit at Belle's skin as she walked through the streets, her footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Her leather jacket did little to fend off the chill, but she had bigger problems than the weather. Rose was out there, God knows where, and if Belle had to break down Victor's door to get her back, so be it. The mansion loomed in the distance, a dark, crumbling silhouette against the night sky. It had always been there, a part of the town's landscape that people preferred not to think about. Like a bad memory you shove to the back of your mind, but can never quite forget. Belle had never been one for spooky stories, but even she had to admit the place looked like it was auditioning for a role in a horror movie. The irony wasn't lost on her. If she hadn't been so pissed off, she might have even laughed at the cliché of it all. Of course, the big bad beast lives in a mansion that looks like it's been waiting for a haunted house tour, Belle muttered under her breath. She shoved her hands deeper into her jacket pockets and kept walking, her mind replaying Leo's words over and over. Victor's reputation had always been more of a ghost story to keep the town entertained, a boogeyman parents warned their kids about, but now it felt real, too real. Belle could still see Leo's smug grin, and it only fueled her anger. Victor! She spat, her breath visible in the cold air. The idea of some scarred recluse thinking he could just snatch girls off the street pissed her off more than she cared to admit. Sure, the guy had his face half melted or whatever, but that didn't give him a free pass to go full monster. As she got closer to the mansion, the streetlights thinned out until they disappeared completely, leaving Belle in near darkness. The path leading up to Victor's place was overgrown, the wild brush and twisted trees surrounding it like skeletal fingers reaching out to drag her in. Subtle, she muttered, stepping over the thick roots that had broken through the cracked pavement. Nothing says I'm not a total psychopath like a driveway straight out of a horror flick. The mansion came into full view as she rounded the corner, and Belle had to admit it was worse than she'd expected. The place wasn't just old, it looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Windows boarded up, roof caving in, and a general air of neglect that made it seem more like a forgotten tomb than a home. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the edge of her awareness. Despite its decay, the mansion felt alive. It wasn't just the flickering light she could see faintly through one of the windows or the faint rustling of the trees around it. It was something heavier, a sense of anticipation, like the house was watching her approach, waiting. Belle shook her head. Get a grip, she told herself, her voice cutting through the eerie quiet. This was just a house, and Victor was just a man. A twisted, dangerous man, sure, but nothing she couldn't handle. Still, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut as she stood at the base of the cracked steps leading up to the front door. The mansion towered above her, casting long shadows across the yard. It was the kind of place where you half expected to hear the creak of a door opening on its own, or see a shadow moving in the window when no one should be there. But Belle wasn't here for ghost stories. She was here for Rose. She took a deep breath and started up the steps. The wood groaned under her weight, threatening to give way at any moment, but Belle pressed on, refusing to let the place get under her skin. At the top of the stairs, she reached for the massive iron knocker, an elaborate thing shaped like a snarling lion's head, its eyes hollow and empty. She almost laughed at how on the nose it was. Of course, Victor would have something like this. Drama queen. She lifted the knocker and slammed it against the door, the sound echoing through the still night. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no movement from inside. Just silence. Belle tried again, harder this time, the force of the knock sending a dull ache through her arm. Still nothing. All right, asshole, she muttered, pushing against the door. It gave way with a long, drawn-out creak, as though it hadn't been opened in years. The inside was dark, but Belle could make out the vague shapes of furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. The place reeked of abandonment. It was grand once, maybe even beautiful in its prime, but now it was just a decaying shell of its former self. Torn curtains hung limply from the windows, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of rot and mildew. Belle moved cautiously, her footsteps barely audible on the cracked marble floors. The whole place felt like it was on the verge of collapsing, like one wrong move might bring the entire mansion down around her. She couldn't help but think of all the stories she'd heard over the years, about girls who wandered too close to Victor's mansion and never came back, about the things he was rumored to do to them. But Belle wasn't here to be scared. She was here for answers. She wandered deeper into the mansion, her eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. The place was huge, and it was clear that Victor had let it rot around him. Why anyone would choose to live in a place like this was beyond her. It was more like a mausoleum than a home. As she moved through what looked like an old parlor, Belle spotted something strange. A series of elaborate portraits hung on the wall, most of them obscured by dust and time. One caught her eye, a portrait of a young man, his features sharp and handsome, but there was something off about it. The face was familiar, almost too familiar. It clicked. It was Victor, before. Belle stepped closer, wiping away the grime with the sleeve of her jacket. It was him, all right, before whatever had happened to his face, before he became the beast. But this version of Victor looked different. There was something in his eyes that felt out of place in a town like this. Pride, maybe even arrogance. Whatever had turned him into the broken man people whispered about had taken all of that away. This wasn't the same man who supposedly dragged girls off the streets. Or maybe it was, and that's what made it all the more dangerous. "Guess the years haven't been kind," Belle said under her breath, turning away from the portrait and heading deeper into the mansion. If Victor was here, she was going to find him, and she wasn't leaving until she got Rose back. The further she went, the darker the mansion became, the rooms growing colder, the silence more oppressive. It was like the house itself was trying to swallow her whole, bury her under its weight. But Belle kept moving, her mind focused on the task at hand. Rose was out there, and she wasn't going to let some overgrown ghost story stop her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached a set of large double doors at the end of a long hallway. The wood was cracked and worn, but there was something about the doors that felt different from the rest of the house, like they had been used recently, unlike the rest of the mansion, which seemed untouched by human hands for years. This was it, Victor's lair. Belle took a deep breath and pushed the doors open. Chapter 5. Meeting the Beast. The doors creaked open, revealing a grand room that was anything but grand now. The place had once been impressive, high ceilings, chandeliers, and wide windows that let in moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows. But now it looked like a mausoleum for someone who had given up on life a long time ago. Dust clung to everything, and the air was thick, stale, as if it hadn't been touched by fresh air in years. Belle's gaze swept the room, searching for any sign of Victor. Her heartbeat was steady, but her body was tense, ready. She'd dealt with worse than whatever this place could throw at her, or so she told herself. She moved cautiously across the room, her boots echoing on the cracked marble floor. A fire burned low in the massive fireplace, barely more than embers. Someone had been here recently. Then she saw him. Victor was sitting in an armchair near the fireplace, his form shrouded in shadow. His face, what little she could make out, was obscured by the darkness, but his body was tense, rigid, like a predator waiting to pounce. He was big, bigger than she'd imagined. His broad shoulders slouched under the weight of something heavier than physical burden, and his posture radiated danger, but also pain. "So," Belle said, breaking the silence, "you're the big bad beast everyone's so scared of." Victor didn't move, his eyes dark and tense, locked onto hers. For a moment he said nothing, just studied her with a look that was half curiosity, half warning. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of voice you'd expect from someone who'd spent too many years alone with their own thoughts. "I told you not to come," he said, his tone even but carrying the weight of a threat. "This isn't your fight." Belle crossed her arms, standing her ground. "Yeah, well, I don't take orders from you, and I'm not leaving without Rose." Victor let out a harsh laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know what you've walked into." Belle raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I know enough. You took Rose, and I'm here to get her back. Simple as that." He shifted slightly in his chair, the firelight casting brief glimpses of his face, scarred, twisted, and marked by whatever tragedy had turned him into this recluse. But Belle wasn't here to pity him, and she wasn't here to play his game. If Victor thought he could intimidate her with a few scars and a deep voice, he had another thing coming. "You think you can just barge in here and demand things?" Victor's voice was sharp now, edged with anger. "You don't understand the situation. She's safer here than out there. Safe? Belle scoffed. You think locking her up in this haunted house is the solution? Rose didn't ask for your protection, and she sure as hell didn't ask to be dragged away in the middle of the night. Victor stood then, moving with a grace that seemed out of place for someone his size. He towered over her, and Belle felt the weight of his presence like a physical force, but she didn't flinch. She'd stared down bigger monsters than him before. She's not your responsibility, Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Belle looked him dead in the eye, her voice steady. She's my friend. For a moment, the two stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Victor's breath came in low, controlled bursts, but Belle could see the conflict flickering behind his eyes, could sense the war he was fighting within himself. He wanted to scare her off, that much was clear, but there was something else there, too, something deeper, more complicated. Finally, Victor broke the silence. You don't know what you're asking for. Rose came here because she needed protection. Leo, he would have destroyed her. Belle narrowed her eyes. And what, you're her savior now? Is that how you see yourself? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a man too afraid to face the world. Victor's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. You don't know anything about me. Then enlighten me, Belle shot back, her voice rising. Because right now, you're not the hero in this story. You're the one who took my friend. Victor turned away, walking toward the fireplace, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. For a moment he was silent, staring into the dying flames as if they held the answers to all his problems. People like me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We don't get to be the heroes. We're the monsters in the stories, the ones everyone's too afraid to even look at. Belle watched him, her anger simmering beneath the surface, but something about the way he said it caught her off guard. She had expected arrogance, cruelty even, but what she saw now was something far different. Victor wasn't the beast they all whispered about. He was just a man, broken and scarred by things he hadn't asked for. Maybe, Belle said quietly, but that doesn't give you the right to decide who lives or dies in your little kingdom. Victor turned back to her, his expression hard, unreadable. You think Leo would have let her live? He's destroyed more than just bodies out there. He breaks people. He would have broken her. Belle felt the weight of his words, but she wasn't ready to back down. So what's your plan, Victor? Keep her locked up here forever? Hide her from the world like you've hidden yourself? Victor stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. It's better than what Leo would have done. And what about me? Belle asked, her voice sharp. Are you going to lock me up too? Keep me safe from the world? For a long moment, Victor didn't respond. The fire crackled weakly behind him, the only sound in the otherwise suffocating silence of the mansion. His eyes flicked between hers, searching for something, though Belle wasn't sure what. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. No. Belle held his gaze, refusing to back down, but she could see the conflict in him. He wasn't a beast. He was a man who'd been caged by his own fear, just like the rest of them. And whatever he thought he was protecting, Belle wasn't convinced it was enough. Victor turned away again, pacing near the fireplace, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. You can leave now, he said quietly, his back to her. Forget about Rose, forget about me. You walk out that door and I'll pretend you were never here. Belle's eyes narrowed. And if I don't? Victor's body stiffened, but he didn't turn around. Then we make a deal. Chapter 6. The deal. Belle's eyes narrowed as she watched Victor pace in front of the fireplace, his massive frame casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. His back was to her, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the dying fire. She crossed her arms, waiting. She wasn't the kind of girl who let people leave her hanging. Finally, Victor stopped, his hand resting on the back of the armchair. He didn't turn around, but his voice was clear. You want Rose back, he said flatly. Belle rolled her eyes. No, I came all the way here for the ambiance. Of course I want Rose back. He didn't react to her sarcasm, and Belle's frustration only grew. She was tired, cold, and irritated by the entire situation. She didn't have time for some tortured beastman's mind games. Victor turned then, his scarred face illuminated in the firelight. His eyes, dark and intense, were locked on hers. She came here for protection. Belle scoffed. shifting her weight onto one leg. Right, because being holed up in this Gothic mansion is so much safer than dealing with Leo. I'm sure Rose is just loving the hospitality. Victor's gaze didn't waver. She came here of her own accord, Belle. Leo was going to kill her. He's been making an example out of anyone who defies him. Belle's jaw tightened. She knew Leo was a monster, but hearing it said out loud like this only fueled the fire in her chest. Rose had never mentioned being in that much danger, but maybe that was the point. Girls like them didn't have the luxury of talking about fear. They just dealt with it. Victor stepped forward, his voice low but firm. I gave her a choice: stay here where Leo can't get to her, or take her chances on the streets. She chose to stay. Belle's eyes flickered with skepticism. So what? You're running a charity now? The town recluse opens his doors to damsels in distress? Victor's face hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. I'm no hero, Belle. I didn't save her because I wanted to. I did it because someone had to. Belle stared at him, weighing his words. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but she could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't lying, at least not about why Rose was here. That didn't mean she trusted him, though. Fine, Belle said, her voice steady but laced with defiance. She made her choice, but I'm taking her back. Victor didn't move, his gaze locked on hers with a kind of intensity that made her skin prickle. No, you're not. Belle's fists clenched. Watch me. Victor stepped closer, his presence dominating the room. You think you're just going to march her out of here and waltz back into Leo's territory like nothing's happened? He'll kill her the moment she sets foot on those streets. Then I'll deal with Leo, Belle shot back. It's not your call to make. Victor was silent for a moment, his eyes searching hers, looking for something. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost tired. You're not leaving without her, are you? Belle shook her head, her gaze unwavering. Nope. Victor sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned away from her, his eyes falling on the dying fire in the hearth. I can't let her leave, not yet. Not until I know she's safe. Belle let out a sharp laugh. Safe? You've got a funny definition of safe, Victor. She's a prisoner in your creepy mansion. That's not safety. That's just another cage. Victor spun around, his eyes flashing with anger. She's alive, isn't she? You think Leo would have kept her that way? Belle stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. No, but that's her decision to make, not yours. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, but Belle didn't flinch. She could see the conflict in Victor's eyes, the struggle between the beast and the man. He wasn't a villain, but he wasn't a saint either. He was just another person trying to survive in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. Victor ran a hand through his hair, the fire casting flickering shadows on his scarred face. There's one way this ends. Yeah? Belle raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Victor turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You stay. Belle blinked, taken off guard for the first time. What? You stay, Victor repeated. You stay here with me. Give me a week. If after that you still want to take Rose, I'll let you. No arguments. No more fighting. But until then, she stays here. And so do you. Belle stared at him, unsure if she'd heard him right. You want me to stay in this dump for a week? Victor's lips twitched, a hint of something that might have been humor in his eyes. Think of it as a temporary truce. Belle's mind raced. This wasn't what she'd expected. She thought she'd have to fight her way out or negotiate some kind of deal to get Rose. But a week? Could she really stay here, in this decaying mansion with Victor and his brooding intensity? She glanced toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was the challenge in Victor's eyes, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that there was more to this than she understood. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. 1 week. But I'm not playing house, and I'm not your guest. I'm here for Rose, and the second this week is up, we're out of here. Victor nodded, his expression serious. Deal. Belle narrowed her eyes. And you better not pull any weird beast in the tower crap, or I'll be out that door faster than you can say Stockholm Syndrome. Victor almost smiled at that, but the moment passed as quickly as it had come. He nodded again, stepping aside to let her pass. Belle walked toward the door, but she stopped just short of it, turning back to him. I mean it. 1 week. Victor's gaze met hers, his expression unreadable. 1 week. Belle gave him one last look before heading out of the room. Her heart was still racing, her mind spinning with a million thoughts. But one thing was certain. This was going to be the longest week of her life. Chapter 7. An Unlikely Bond. The first morning in Victor's mansion wasn't exactly luxurious. Belle woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards and the musty scent of the place finally creeping up her nose. She groaned, pushing herself up from the ancient couch she'd crashed on the night before. Her neck hurt, her back ached, and she was pretty sure there were enough cobwebs hanging around to trap a whole colony of spiders. "Charming," she muttered, stretching her arms. The mansion was as decayed in the daylight as it had been in the dark. The faint sunlight coming through the windows only highlighted how much dust and grime covered every surface. Belle could practically feel the layers of history rotting away around her, but she wasn't here for the ambiance. She was here for Rose. She found Victor downstairs in what looked like a dining room, though it had clearly seen better days. He was sitting at the far end of a long, weathered table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee. His face, now illuminated by the light streaming in through the high windows, looked even more haunted than it had last night. The scars that marred his features caught the light in ways that made them more noticeable, but it wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he sat, like he was waiting for something to finally end. "Rough night?" Belle asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Victor didn't look up right away. When he did, there was something distant in his eyes, like he hadn't slept. "You could say that." Belle walked further into the room, glancing at the cobweb-covered chandelier hanging precariously above them. "Let me guess, been brooding by the fire all night? Or is that just a full-time hobby?" Victor didn't take the bait. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This place isn't for you, Belle. You're wasting your time here." "Yeah, well, I didn't have a whole lot of better options." Belle shot back, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. "Besides, I'm not exactly in the habit of leaving my friends behind." Victor's gaze finally met hers. "You think I wanted this? You think I enjoy being trapped in this tomb?" Belle raised an eyebrow. "You're acting like the door's locked. Newsflash, you can leave any time you want." Victor's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." Belle leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Oh, I think it is. You just don't want to admit it. You're hiding out here, playing the part of the tortured beast, and for what? So people can leave you alone? So you don't have to deal with the mess outside?" Victor slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "You think you know me? You think you understand what it's like to be this?" Belle didn't flinch, even as the table rattled. She locked eyes with him, unbothered by his outburst. "I get that life screws people over. Trust me, I know. But don't stand there pretending like you're some kind of victim when you're the one who's choosing to live in this wreckage." Victor stared at her, his breath heavy, but the anger started to fade from his expression. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't expect you to understand." Belle shook her head, letting out a sharp laugh. "Of course not, because it's easier to believe you're the only one with problems, right? It's easier to sit here playing the tragic figure than it is to actually face what's out there." Victor's silence stretched on, and Belle didn't bother filling it. She'd seen this kind of self-pity before, even in herself. The world was hard, and sometimes it was easier to retreat than to fight back. But that didn't mean you got a free pass to drag everyone else down with you. After a long pause, Victor finally spoke again, his voice quieter. "It's not just Leo, it's everything. The way people look at me, the way they treat me. I thought maybe if I stayed out here I could, I don't know, be something else, someone else." Belle studied him for a moment before speaking, her voice softer now. "You can't run from what people think, and you can't change how they look at you, but you can stop giving a damn about it." Victor looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Easy for you to say," Belle smirked. "You think so? Take a walk in my shoes for a night. You'll get real comfortable with people looking at you like you're worth less than the dirt they walk on." Victor didn't respond, but she could see her words sinking in. He wasn't as invincible as he pretended to be. Beneath the scars, the gruff exterior, he was just another person trying to survive, in a world that had chewed him up and spat him out. Belle understood that better than anyone. "Look," she said, leaning forward, "you've got 1 week. After that, I'm taking Rose, and we're out of here. But if you want to mope around and act like a victim the whole time, that's on you. I've got enough of my own problems." Victor's gaze softened just for a moment, and he nodded. "I'm not going to stop you. You want to go, you can go. I didn't want her to get hurt." Belle sighed, rubbing her temples. "We're all hurt, Victor. That's the point. But running from it isn't going to make it go away." For the next few days, the mansion settled into a strange rhythm. Belle and Victor kept their distance at first, only crossing paths when necessary. She spent her time poking around the old place, finding odd relics from Victor's past. A piano covered in dust, old photographs of a family she assumed was his, letters scattered across desks that hadn't been touched in years. There was a life here once, something real and tangible, but now it was just a hollow shell. Victor, on the other hand, kept to himself. He spent most of his time brooding, wandering from room to room like a ghost haunting his own past. But slowly, something started to shift. Their brief, biting conversations became more frequent. The walls Victor had built around himself started to crack. One night, Belle found herself sitting by the fire with him. Neither of them spoke at first, the silence between them comfortable in its own way. Victor stared into the flames, lost in thought, while Belle leaned back in her chair, staring at the dark ceiling above them. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Belle asked, breaking the silence. Victor didn't look at her, but his voice was thoughtful when he answered. "I used to, but after everything, it felt like there wasn't anywhere left for me." Belle shrugged. "You don't need a place to belong, you just need somewhere to start over." Victor glanced at her then, his expression softer, less guarded. "And where would you start?" Belle smirked. "Hell if I know, but anywhere's better than here." A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at Victor's lips, and for the first time since she'd met him, Belle saw something human behind the scars. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days passed, their exchanges became less tense, more natural. They shared dark humor, poked fun at the crumbling mansion, and occasionally they even managed to laugh. Belle found herself seeing a different side of Victor, one that wasn't just a broken man hiding from the world. He was intelligent, funny in a dry, sarcastic way, and despite everything, he still had a spark of something in him that hadn't been entirely extinguished. And Victor saw something in Belle, too. Beneath her tough exterior, there was a fierce determination, a strength he hadn't expected. She wasn't afraid of him, and she wasn't afraid to challenge him either. In some strange, twisted way, he found himself respecting her for that. They weren't friends, not yet, but they were no longer enemies either. Chapter 8. Leo's Revenge. Back in the heart of the town, Leo was fuming. The neon lights from the local dive bar flickered like broken promises above his head, casting shadows across his scarred knuckles as he clenched his fists. Belle hadn't shown up for days. That was one thing. But to hear she was holed up with Victor, of all people, that was a whole other kind of betrayal. He slammed his glass down on the bar, the amber liquid splashing over the rim. The bartender shot him a wary look, but wisely said nothing. Leo had that reputation, the kind of guy you didn't talk to unless you wanted trouble, and tonight, trouble was brewing. "She thinks she can just walk away?" Leo muttered to himself, his voice low and venomous. "That freak thinks he can just take what's mine?" In his twisted mind, everything was a matter of ownership. Belle, Rose, all the girls, they were his. And no one, especially not some scarred-up recluse, was going to take that away from him. One of Leo's lackeys, a wiry guy named Vince, leaned over from the bar stool next to him. He had the look of someone who was constantly calculating whether to run or stick around, a rat through and through. "So what's the plan, boss?" Vince asked, his voice dripping with nervous energy. "You can't just let her shack up with the beast." Leo shot him a glare that could kill a man twice his size. "Shut up, Vince. I know that." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, plotting his next move. This wasn't just about Belle anymore. This was about control. Victor had been a thorn in Leo's side for years. The girls had always been scared of him, whispering about how he was dangerous, how he was hiding something dark and twisted in that mansion of his. Most of the time, Leo encouraged the rumors. Fear was good for business. But now, it was personal. Victor had crossed a line, and Leo was going to make sure everyone knew who really ran this town. He wasn't about to let some ghost of a man undercut his authority. Leo turned to Vince, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Get the boys together. We're going to pay Victor a little visit." Vince blinked, clearly not thrilled at the prospect. "You sure about that? I mean, the guy's, kind of a psycho." Leo's grin widened. "So am I." Vince gave a half-hearted chuckle, but there was fear in his eyes. Leo noticed, but he didn't care. Vince was weak, but he was loyal enough when it counted. And besides, Leo had enough muscle to make sure this ended in his favor. Victor might have his creepy mansion, but Leo had the numbers. Leo stood up from the bar, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the counter. "Tell the boys to meet me out front in an hour. Make sure they're armed." "Armed?" Vince's eyes widened. "We're going in hot?" Leo gave him a look that said, "What do you think?" "We're not going there to talk, Vince. We're going there to make sure Victor learns his place." Vince swallowed hard but nodded, scurrying off to gather the others. Leo watched him leave, his mind already racing with the possibilities. This was going to be more than just a warning. He was going to send a message, not just to Victor, but to everyone in this town who thought they could stand up to him. As he left the bar, the cold night air hit him, but Leo barely noticed. His blood was boiling, and the thought of getting his hands on Victor, or better yet, watching that monster crumble, was all the warmth he needed. Leo wasn't stupid, though. He knew Victor wasn't the kind of guy you walked up to and punched in the face. He had a reputation, after all. The scars weren't just for show. Rumor had it Victor had tangled with worse than Leo in the past, and he hadn't come out on top unscathed, but he hadn't gone down either. But that's what made it fun for Leo. He wanted the fight, the blood, the chance to break someone like Victor and show the world what real power looked like. And if Belle got caught in the crossfire, well, that was just the cost of doing business. An hour later, Leo stood in front of the bar, his crew gathered around him. It wasn't a huge group, but they were loyal enough. Armed with baseball bats, crowbars, and a couple of handguns Leo had acquired through less than legal means, they looked more like a pack of hyenas than an army, but they'd get the job done. Vince stood next to him, fidgeting with the sleeve of his jacket. "So, we really doing this?" Leo's grin returned, full of malice. "You're damn right we are." The group moved through the town, the streets eerily quiet around them. The closer they got to Victor's mansion, the more the air seemed to thicken, like the town itself knew something bad was about to happen. Vince glanced nervously up at the mansion as they approached. "Place gives me the creeps," Leo snorted. "It should. That freak's been hiding in there too long. Time to smoke him out." The mansion loomed ahead of them, a dark silhouette against the night sky. It looked like something out of a nightmare, broken, decayed, and yet somehow still standing. The windows were dark, but Leo knew Victor was in there, watching, waiting. "All right," Leo said, his voice low but commanding. "We go in, we find him, and we make sure he knows who runs this town. If he wants to play monster, we'll show him how it's done." The group spread out as they reached the mansion's front steps. Leo felt a rush of adrenaline as they moved forward, the sense of impending violence making his blood sing. He was ready for this. He was going to rip that place apart, brick by brick if he had to, until Victor was kneeling at his feet. "Kick the door in," Leo growled, nodding to one of the bigger guys in his crew. The man nodded, stepping up to the front door and lifting his boot. With a loud crack, the door splintered inward, the old wood giving way almost too easily. The sound echoed through the mansion, and for a moment, the group hesitated, staring into the dark void beyond. Leo pushed past them, stepping inside first. "What's the matter? Scared of the dark?" He grinned, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. The place looked even worse on the inside, like a mausoleum that had been left to rot for decades. Dust clung to every surface, and the air was thick with decay. Leo's grin only widened. Victor's kingdom was nothing more than a graveyard. He motioned for the others to follow him as they spread out, their weapons raised and ready. "Search the place. Find him." The crew moved through the mansion like a pack of wolves, their footsteps heavy on the cracked marble floors. Leo felt a thrill run through him as he imagined Victor cowering in some corner, finally realizing that he wasn't the one in control anymore. But as they pushed deeper into the mansion, something began to shift. The air felt thicker, the shadows darker. Vince looked around, clearly spooked. Boss, this place ain't right." Leo waved him off. "You getting scared of some dust, Vince? Man up." They continued forward, but Leo couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that Victor was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Good, Leo thought. Let him try. Let him see what happens when you push a man like me too far. "Find him," Leo growled again, the anticipation building. They were coming for Victor, whether he was ready or not. Chapter 9. The Final Showdown. The mansion felt like it was holding its breath. Belle paced in front of the dusty windows, her eyes flicking between the darkened woods outside, and Victor, who stood by the fireplace, still and silent. The uneasy quiet inside didn't match the rising tension in her chest. She could feel it, like the calm before a storm. Leo was coming. She knew it, Victor knew it, and even the damn walls seemed to know it. "How many?" Victor asked, his voice a low rumble. Belle paused, turning toward him. "Leo's not the subtle type. He'll bring a pack. 4, 5, maybe more. Guys who like to swing bats and break things." Victor nodded, still facing the fire. "They think they'll just walk in here and take what they want." Belle crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Well, they're not exactly big on long-term strategy, so yeah, they probably do." Victor finally turned to face her, his scarred face cast in the flickering light. For a moment there was something in his expression, something like calm acceptance, as if he'd already resigned himself to the coming fight. Then he let out a slow breath, the tension slipping from his shoulders. "They're in for a surprise." Belle smirked. "Damn right, they are. We're not going to roll over for that asshole." Just as the words left her mouth, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep in the mansion. Belle's heart kicked into gear. It was time. They were here. Victor grabbed an old, rusted iron poker from beside the fireplace, testing its weight in his hand. "You ever fight, Belle?" Belle let out a dark laugh, flexing her fingers. "Honey, I've been fighting my whole life." The crashing sounds grew louder. Leo's men were tearing through the front of the mansion like a wrecking ball, kicking in doors, shattering windows, and making enough noise to wake the dead. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to destroy. Victor moved toward the door of the room, glancing over his shoulder at Belle. "Stay behind me," Belle scoffed. "Stay behind you? I'm not some damsel in distress. Let's go." Victor gave her a look that was halfway between a warning and amusement. "Fine, just stay alive." As they moved down the grand hallway toward the main entrance, the destruction became more obvious. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. The walls were splintered, and the faint glow of flashlights bounced through the mansion's crumbling halls. Belle could hear the gruff voices of Leo's men, getting closer, meaner with every word. "We split up," Belle whispered, grabbing a heavy candlestick from an old side table. "We catch them off guard. You come from the front, I'll flank them." Victor raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Don't do anything stupid." "Stupid is my default setting," Belle shot back with a grin. Victor grunted, moving toward the foyer with heavy, deliberate steps. Belle darted down a side hallway, her heartbeat quickening. She wasn't scared. No, that wasn't it. But there was something about this moment, knowing Leo was here, that felt like the culmination of years of unresolved anger. Leo wasn't just a pimp or a thug. He was a symbol of everything that had held her down, that had held all of them down. It was time to show him that she wasn't going to be controlled anymore. She pressed her back against the wall as she neared the sounds of breaking wood and glass. From her position, she could hear Leo's voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Where is he?" Leo snarled, his voice echoing through the open space of the foyer. "Where's that freak? Come on out, Victor. Let's settle this once and for all." Belle peeked around the corner. There he was, Leo, standing at the center of the destruction, flanked by 3 of his goons. Vince, the nervous rat from the bar, hovered near the back, clutching a crowbar like it was his lifeline. Victor's heavy footsteps echoed through the hall as he approached, drawing Leo's attention. The men tensed as Victor stepped into view, the iron poker held loosely in one hand. "There he is," Leo growled, his grin widening like a predator who just cornered his prey. "The big bad beast." Victor didn't say a word, his eyes fixed on Leo with an icy, unblinking stare. Belle knew that look. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. Leo spread his arms, as if welcoming Victor into a trap. I knew it'd come to this, you know. You've been messing with my business for too long, hiding in this dump like you're some kind of untouchable. Well, guess what, Victor? You're not untouchable. You're just a broken freak, and I'm here to finish you. Victor still didn't respond. He simply stood there, a looming shadow of calm in the midst of chaos. That's when Belle struck. She darted from her hiding place, bringing the candlestick down on one of Leo's thugs with a solid crack. The guy crumpled to the floor, his crowbar clattering uselessly beside him. Belle spun toward Vince, who looked like he was about to wet himself. She gave him a quick shove, sending him sprawling onto the floor. "Nice of you to drop by," Belle sneered, her eyes locked on Leo as she brandished her makeshift weapon. Leo's grin faltered as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered, but he quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing at Belle. "You think you can stop me, Belle? After everything I've done for you?" Belle laughed, a dark, bitter sound. "Done for me? You've done nothing but control us, use us. You're nothing, Leo, and I'm done letting you think otherwise." Leo's face twisted with rage. He pulled a knife from his belt, brandishing it toward Belle. "You always had a mouth on you. Guess it's time I shut it for good." Before he could make a move, Victor lunged forward with the poker, swinging it with brutal force. It connected with Leo's arm, knocking the knife from his hand and sending him stumbling backward. The look of shock on Leo's face was priceless. "You want to fight?" Victor growled, advancing on Leo. "You've got one." Leo scrambled to his feet, grabbing the knife again and lunging at Victor, but Belle was faster. She swung the candlestick like a bat, catching Leo across the side and sending him crashing into the remnants of an old bookshelf. "Get up, Leo," Belle snarled, standing over him. "Come on, show me how tough you are now." Leo groaned, clutching his ribs. His men, what was left of them, were either out cold or running for the door. Vince had already disappeared, leaving Leo alone with the very people he thought he could destroy. Victor stepped forward, looming over Leo like a dark shadow. "This is your last chance. Leave now and never come back." Leo spat blood onto the floor, his face contorted with fury. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Belle crouched down beside him, her voice low and full of venom. "I think you're done, Leo, and you know it. You lost the moment you thought you could control us." Leo's eyes darted between them, his rage replaced with a flicker of fear. He had nothing left. His empire, his power, it was all crumbling around him. Victor raised the poker again, but Belle held up her hand. "No, he's not worth it." For a long moment, the room was still, the tension hanging in the air like smoke. Then Victor lowered the poker, his eyes never leaving Leo. Leo struggled to his feet, his face pale and twisted in defeat. Without another word, he stumbled toward the door, limping away into the night. Belle stood there, watching him disappear into the shadows. She let out a long breath, her body finally relaxing as the adrenaline began to fade. Victor glanced at her, his voice soft. "You didn't have to do that." Belle smirked, tossing the candlestick to the side. "What, missed the chance to knock Leo down a few pegs? Please, that was the most fun I've had in weeks." Victor chuckled, a sound that was almost light. "He won't be back." "No," Belle agreed, "he won't." As they stood there, the remnants of the fight settling around them, Belle realized something. The mansion might have been broken, but it wasn't the only thing. She and Victor were broken too. But maybe, just maybe, they could start picking up the pieces. Chapter 10. The mansion was quiet now. The fight was over, the dust settling on the shattered remnants of Leo's ego, and a few of his goons, scattered throughout the foyer. Belle stood at the edge of the room, her breathing steady as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a sharp clarity in its wake. Victor stood by the broken doorway, watching the night outside with an unreadable expression. He was calm, too calm, considering what had just happened. His broad shoulders slumped ever so slightly, like the weight of the world had finally gotten to him. "Well," Belle said, her voice cutting through the silence, "that was fun." Victor glanced at her, his scarred face barely betraying any emotion. "Is that what you call fun?" Belle smirked, shrugging. "Not exactly my idea of a vacation, but it's better than standing on a corner." They stood in silence for a moment, the mansion eerily still around them. Belle's mind raced, trying to make sense of what came next. Leo was gone, his hold on the town broken, but that didn't mean everything was magically better. There were always consequences, and the streets had a way of reminding you who really ran things. Victor broke the silence first. "You're free to leave, you know. Rose can go with you. I'll even make sure no one comes after you. Leo's not going to be a problem anymore." Belle studied him for a moment, crossing her arms. "You really think it's that simple? That we can just walk away and start fresh somewhere?" Victor turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Isn't that what you wanted? To get Rose out of here?" Belle hesitated. She had wanted that. She'd been ready to tear down walls to get her friend back, to escape this hellhole and finally breathe again. But now, standing here, after everything that had happened, it didn't feel as simple as she'd thought. "You've been hiding here for years," Belle said, her voice softer now. "Why didn't you just leave? Why stick around in this place if you knew it wasn't safe?" Victor's gaze drifted back to the shattered doorway. "Sometimes it's easier to stay in the dark than face what's outside." Belle scoffed, shaking her head. "That's a load of crap, Victor. You weren't just hiding from the world, you were hiding from yourself." Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Belle took a step closer, her voice steady. "You're not the only one with scars, you know. The rest of us have been dealing with the same crap. But hiding? That's not living. It's just waiting to die." Victor turned to face her fully, his eyes hard. "And what about you, Belle? You've been running your whole life. From the streets, from Leo, from everything. What makes you think leaving now is going to change anything?" The question hit harder than Belle expected. She didn't have an answer. She'd spent so long fighting for survival, for freedom, but now that the fight was over, the idea of walking away felt empty. "Maybe it won't," Belle admitted, her voice low, "but staying here isn't an option either." Victor stepped closer, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. "You could stay. Both of you. The mansion, it's broken, just like the rest of us, but it's still standing." Belle stared at him, unsure of what he was really offering. This wasn't a fairy tale where everything tied up neatly with a ribbon. They weren't going to ride off into the sunset, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something else, something real. "You're serious?" Belle asked, raising an eyebrow. Victor nodded. "It's not much, but it's better than what's out there." Belle's gaze drifted around the room, the wreckage, the broken furniture, the dark corners. It was a mess, just like her life. But standing here next to Victor, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Stability. Not happiness, not a dream come true, but the possibility of building something from the wreckage. And that was enough. She turned to Victor, her smirk returning. "You know, this place could use some redecorating." Victor let out a quiet laugh, a sound that seemed foreign even to him. "Yeah, I've heard that before." Belle crossed her arms, leaning against the broken door frame. "I'll stay, for now, but don't think this means we're playing house." Victor's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "I wouldn't expect you to." As the tension between them shifted, something unspoken passed through the air. This wasn't about romance or happily ever afters. It was about survival, about finding something worth staying for when the world around you crumbled. Belle turned her attention to the wreckage of the room, the mess that had been left in Leo's wake. "We'll need to clean this up." Victor nodded. "First thing tomorrow." Belle gave him a sideways glance. "You really think Rose is going to want to stay here?" Victor shrugged. "She'll have the choice, just like you." Belle didn't respond, but she knew Victor was right. Rose deserved to make her own decision, just like Belle had. They couldn't control anyone's fate but their own, and as much as Belle hated to admit it, she wasn't ready to leave this place, not yet. There was something about Victor, about the mansion, that felt like unfinished business. "All right," Belle said, standing up straight. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we figure out what the hell comes next." Victor didn't argue. He simply nodded, turning toward the stairs that led to the upper floors of the mansion. As he walked away, Belle watched him, her thoughts swirling. The night had changed everything, but it wasn't the kind of change she'd expected. Victor paused at the bottom of the stairs, glancing back at Belle one last time. "Thank you." Belle blinked. "For what?" "For not leaving." Belle rolled her eyes, her trademark sarcasm kicking back in. Don't get used to it. I'm not much for sticking around. Victor's lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. We'll see. As he disappeared up the stairs, Belle stood in the wreckage of the mansion, the night pressing in around her. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running, and that was enough. For now. Chapter 11. The morning light filtered weakly through the cracked windows of the mansion, casting a dull glow over the dust that still hung in the air. The place looked like it had been through a war, and in a way, it had. Belle sat in one of the less broken chairs by the window, staring out at the overgrown lawn that stretched into the woods beyond. The world outside felt so far away, almost like it was watching, waiting for her to return to the chaos she'd always known. But Belle wasn't in a hurry to go back. Not yet. Rose was sitting on the couch across from her, curled up in a blanket, her face still pale, but more composed than it had been. The bruises from her time under Leo's control were fading, but the scars, the ones you couldn't see, would take longer to heal. Still, Rose had been quiet since the fight with Leo, processing everything in her own way. Belle couldn't blame her. Hell, she was still trying to process it herself. "You okay?" Belle asked, breaking the silence. Rose glanced up at her, her tired eyes softening. "I will be." It wasn't much, but it was something. Belle gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You know, if you want to get out of here, start fresh, I'll help you." Rose looked out the window, the sunlight catching the strands of her messy hair. "I thought I'd want to run, but now, I don't know. I'm tired of running." Belle raised an eyebrow. "So, what? You're thinking of staying?" Rose smiled faintly. "Maybe. I mean, Victor's not so bad, once you get past the whole mysterious recluse thing." Belle chuckled, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah, he grows on you. Like mold." The light banter faded into a comfortable silence again, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled with words. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no immediate danger lurking in the shadows, no fear of Leo showing up and pulling them back into his control. Rose shifted on the couch, her expression turning more thoughtful. "Do you think we can actually have a life here? You know, something normal?" Belle shrugged. "Normal's overrated. But yeah, I think we can make something work. Might not be pretty, but it'll be ours." Rose nodded slowly, the hint of hope flickering in her eyes. "I don't think I ever really knew what that felt like." "Neither did I," Belle admitted, her voice quieter. "But we've got a shot now. That's more than we had before." They sat in the quiet for a while longer, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Belle knew that staying here was no fairy tale ending, but that was fine by her. She'd stopped believing in those a long time ago. What mattered now was that they had a choice. Leo was gone, his grip on their lives shattered, and for the first time, they were free to decide what came next. Victor appeared at the doorway, his imposing figure softened by the morning light. He wasn't wearing the weight of his old life the way he had before, and for a brief second, Belle saw the man beneath the scars, the one who had been hiding from the world as much as they had. "Everything all right?" Victor asked, his deep voice rumbling through the room. Rose glanced at Belle before nodding. "Yeah, we're okay." Victor lingered in the doorway for a moment longer before stepping inside, his movements less guarded than they had been in the past. Belle noticed how much had changed in such a short time. He wasn't the beast that the town had made him out to be, not to them anyway. Victor turned to Belle, his expression serious but not unkind. "You could leave, you know, if you want to." Belle smirked, leaning forward in her chair. "Are you trying to get rid of me already?" Victor's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Just making sure you know your options." Belle stood up, stretching her arms above her head. "Oh, I know my options, but I think I'm going to stick around a little longer, at least until you figure out how to fix that roof. Place is practically falling apart." Victor chuckled softly. "Deal." Belle crossed the room to stand beside him, glancing back at Rose. "What about you? You in?" Rose hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I think I am. Maybe it's time I stopped running." Belle gave her a nod of approval. "Good. About time." Victor glanced between them, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then he nodded as well. "We'll make it work. Together." Belle looked out the window, the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the glass, bathing the broken world outside in a warm, forgiving light. It wasn't perfect, hell, it was far from it, but it was theirs now. And that was enough. As the three of them stood there, side by side in the crumbling mansion, the weight of the past seemed to lift just a little. Belle wasn't sure what the future held. None of them did. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to run. She wasn't a damsel in distress, and Victor wasn't a prince. They were just two broken people in a broken world, trying to make something that resembled a life. And somehow that felt right. Belle turned to Victor with a grin. "So what's next? You gonna teach me how to fix that roof, or are we just gonna watch it cave in?" Victor smirked. "Depends. You any good with a hammer?" "I'm good with breaking things," Belle said with a smirk. "Building? That's a whole new adventure." Victor laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to fill the room, and for a brief moment everything felt lighter. They weren't fixed, and they weren't whole, but they were still here. And that was enough. The world outside was still a mess, but in this small, decaying mansion, they had found something worth holding on to. And for Belle, for Rose, and for Victor, that was more than they'd ever expected. And with that, the story draws to a close. The end. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this retelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss new stories. We bring classic plays, fairy tales, and timeless stories to life with a fresh twist. And if you know someone who'd enjoy these reimagined tales, please share the channel with them. Your support helps us continue to grow and bring more stories to you.